The fourth quarter is hosted by the Wits City Studio. So this installment of the Wits City Studio is called the Kelvin-Alexandra-Frankenwald City Studio. And Marie, if you could just go to the slide for. So the studio is located northeast of the Joburg CBD. So what you're seeing on this map is the watershed and the mining belt in the center. And then the colored areas on the map are divisions of income. So you can see a very wealthy area to the north. And the City Studio is focusing specifically, next slide, it's looking at the intersection between Alexandra. So this image, you can see the Huchzermeyer River in the center, Alexandra to the south, and then to the north. So this is the same view, but looking north, you can see the big open land in the middle. That's the property that we recently purchased from Wits University, Frankenwald, with Frankenwald industrial area just beyond that. And then just to the left, you can see the suburb of Culwick. So the studio critically engages with the enduring and deepening South African challenges of urban inequality and spatial injustice evident in this context. And it seeks not only to understand how these conditions are reproduced and intensified, but it also seeks to understand how bottom-up processes can shape, reshape, and reframe what the future of this context might look like. So today's session specifically is focused on everyday practices in Alexandra and Stjwetla. And just to locate you, Stjwetla is this area in the front of this image with Alexandra proper behind. And it considers how residents navigate questions of safety, care, infrastructure, both individually and collectively. It also aims to highlight how grassroots initiatives, informal economies, and governance arrangements produce a certain level of urban viability, legitimacy within the context of structural constraints of growth and policy. So our speakers today, we've got 4 great speakers with us. The first presentation will be co-presented by Dr. Paulo Moreira and Siphelele and Ngobese. So Paulo is an architect, researcher, and a Postdoctoral Centennial Fellow at the Center for Urbanism and Built Environment Studies, or CUBES, here at Wits. His work examines reciprocity in Kelvin-Alexandra-Frankenwald within the Wits City Studio, exploring how communities, materials, and urban infrastructures interact. Siphelele is a researcher in Inclusive Cities program at the South African City Network and has a special interest in the interface between urban informality and the world-class aspirations of post-colonial Africa. Our second presentation will be from Professor Marie Huchzermeyer, who will speak on practices of care. Marie is a professor in the School of Architecture and Planning at Wits and director of CUBES. She currently leads the Kelvin-Alexandra-Frankenwald City Studio. And Marie's research is on informal settlements, housing policy, the right to the city, and spatial governance. Her writing has spanned South Africa, Brazil, Germany, Kenya, and other African countries. And then our final presentation will be from Dr. Christina and Culwick Fatti, who will speak on the everyday in relation to just infrastructure transitions and local enterprises. Christina leads the Urban Governance Program at UWC's Politics and Urban Governance Research Group. Her research focuses on environmental sustainability and social justice within cities, focusing on policy-oriented research that is generated through collaborative knowledge creation. And then to close off the session, we're also joined by 2 distinguished respondents, Dr. Mercy Brown-Luthango and Dr. Hannah Dawson. Mercy is joining us online, I think, I hope. And Hannah is with us in person. So Mercy is a sociologist with 20 years experience in academia and NGOs in South Africa. Her research focuses on sustainable human settlements, urban land and affordable housing, and she works on participatory upgrading, safety, youth, and multi-country studies of everyday infrastructure, emphasizing governance and community-based engagements in urban development. Hannah is an associate professor of anthropology in the Anthropology and Relevant Studies Department at the University of Johannesburg, and her research grapples with social, economic, and political shifts stemming from mass unemployment and the way in which the future of work and welfare is being imagined and transformed in Southern Africa. She is author of Making a Life, Young Men on Johannesburg's Urban Margins. So we are truly privileged to have this group of speakers and respondents with us for what promises to be a thought-provoking discussion. And with that, I'll hand over to our first two speakers, Paulo and Siphelele.
Thank you for the opportunity. So I'm going to be topic for the assistant. So our input, and we'll try to make it a quick one, just in terms of the framing, is that we want to situate the everyday within the safety of urban safety within the everyday, and why that's important is because of safety being, one of the preoccupations of the average South African, something that comes to bear on space and society in whatever type of settlement that you are in South Africa, and why it's an issue that's worth thinking about in relation to everything else. So safety is not just about policing and law enforcement, but as something with very high social impacts and whose manifestation is out of the infrastructure or the built environment that we find ourselves in. And why Stjwetla Alexandra-Frankenwald is critical to this is that even though parts of it are informal or informal settlement with a lot of inadequacies, but there's also quite a lot of opportunity and a lot of qualities, including very organically made social structures, and that it's a nice space for the testing of collaborative safety interventions and approaches, and the governance of safety in an all of society model where it's not just the city kind of driving an agenda for safety, but something that grows very much out of community agency as well. So an opportunity and a thread for connecting research, teaching, partnership, and practice. And I'll hand over to Paulo to take us to the next one.
Okay. Thank you, Siphelele. Hello, everyone. And we at the City Studio have been collaborating with the South Africa Cities Network in a series of initiatives. We think that students and researchers and our team here at Wits can be seen as actual stakeholders in spatial inquiry on the everyday. This is a photograph of a poster exhibition at Marlborough Station that we organized last year in October. And we see it as a platform for sharing students' findings publicly, basically. We see students not only as observers, but active participants in generating and shaping knowledge, and being active and actually role players in this urban agenda. That's what we try to do by giving visibility to the students' works. In this particular exhibition, we displayed the second year urban planning design studio. It was led by the course Mapuso, and students were required to investigate challenges facing mostly two areas of Stjwetla that are identified as crime hotspots. And so those nodes were identified, and students developed some design interventions and recommendations, let's say, to improve the perceptions and experiences of safety. As part of this initiative and this collaboration, we also created a sort of interface with the community controllers. Controllers are key actors in the everyday safety in Stjwetla. We were interested to see how, say, small scale but tangible tools could make a difference in their daily activities, and examples of these small and very impactful and actionable contributions and investments to support the community action were, for instance, the handover of raincoats that enable visibility and legitimacy and presence in the neighborhood, as well as, of course, protection from all weather. But we also included two-way radios that strengthen communication and coordination among the controllers. And these are small examples that in a way present how an academic project can meet community needs in a very tangible way. Another dimension of this interface with the community controllers was the spatial impact that we from the beginning we thought we could also contribute to those two crime hotspots that were identified. They serve as gateways to the neighborhood, and they were identified by the patrollers, and we came as a group that could contribute to build two safety shelters that enhanced as well the patrollers' presence and activity in the neighborhood. I won't go too much into this project of the safety shelters. We do have a session later on, part of the seminar series, and it relates to pedagogy in a way as well, because we involve the students in this project. But the aim mostly is to emphasize this shift from a fear-based infrastructure that are usually, these apparatuses of security and control, guard huts and so on. But we saw this as an opportunity also to actually make some community space, social space within the community. This is one of the photographs of one of the favorite shelters.
Okay, so yeah, just to Paulo's point around this transition or the project or the intervention as a way to kind of facilitate and test how you shift from, this architecture of fear to one that is rather care-based and thinking about safety within the context of infrastructure. So that infrastructure intervention you'll see in the image that is shared here, that you have a woman using the space. And what we initially observed when we first had the safety shelters up was that it was a space that kind of invited naturally, men to use the space, but we're quite pleased with seeing how women are also starting to come into and to use the space as well. And why that is significant for us is that, the everyday effect of crime, violence, and unsafety is that retreat of women from our public spaces. And that it facilitates the absence of women, be it in our parks, in our streets, on our pavements, and kind of begins to dictate the time in which women can be involved in public space and effective in public life. And so these are just some of the examples, as you see on the image, of community-wide use of the safety shelters and uses that encourage and invite women to be part and parcel of public life, enabled by infrastructural investments like this that are small but impactful and possibly scalable as well. And then the next one, we wanted to also just touch on the role of the city. So this is an example of an intervention where we're working with students through the studio, but also very much embedded in making sure that the community voice and community contribution is there. But what is the role of the city or the city administration in all of this? Is that, it has a critical role to play in how these small but impactful interventions are scaled up. We see the city as possibly playing the role of a holding space for what we say is an all of society approach. If we say that safety and combating crime and violence is the responsibility and the role of all of society, calling on academia, civil society organizations, everyday residents. We see the city as a holding space for those critical partnerships and collaborations to enable and seed community action, agency, and visibility. And that is critical to nurture these relationships between residents, students, and institutions, and that the city can play a role in kind of creating the holding space and facilitating the strengthening of those relationships. And that, you know, the city has a critical role in seeding the idea that safety is not just an issue of security, an issue of policing, but a condition for dignity and something that very much affects everyday life.
Great. I'd like to just to conclude by presenting this idea of community-led scaling as a key. So what are the next steps in this initiative and this project? How is it evolving? And how is the community also building on this initial investment that we did? And recently we were approached by the Stjwetla patrollers requesting building of a third shelter structure, the third safety shelter, and we are developing this collaboratively again with Wits students and Stjwetla artisans. This is a photo taken yesterday in our studio reviews, where community patrollers and other community members came to school to comment and give feedback and react to the students' proposals. And the first step of this project will be exhibited on the 28th of October, the City Forum exhibition near Marlborough. After that, we will hopefully install the third shelter on site. And so basically our last thought, I'd say, is to call for think of safety not as surveillance, but as care, as collaboration, and as spatial imagination. And I'll leave it here. I'll hand it over to Prof. Marie, who takes the reins of care further in her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about social reproduction and practices of care, and I'll link this back to safety work that patrollers do in Stjwetla. So, but first to talk about these concepts. Social reproduction and practices of care are critical lenses developed in the global north and concerned with everyday life as articulated by capital under neoliberalism. So put differently, social reproduction brings the life-sustaining practices of the everyday, including housing, interrelation with capitalist production and accumulation. Social reproduction includes mental, manual, and emotional forms of work involved in providing the care that is necessary to maintain and reproduce life. Bennett and Al referred to cities as landscapes of stratified reproduction. And in a way, it's very nice to start looking at Stjwetla as that. Social reproduction has also been employed to expose the oppression of women through their visible labor or reproduction on which the capitalist production depends. However, it can also be used as an organizing lens or an open framework that enables us to, this is a quote, to a range of ways in which people shape the circumstances of daily life in relation to conditions of hegemonic capitalist production. So recent studies emphasize that social reproduction is uneven across scales, locations, and jurisdictions. And I mean, our case here of urban inequality is well suited for that. But also historicity or historic dimensions, spatiality, those are both relevant to understanding these variations. So in the context of unevenness of social reproduction, may be co-determined by the historicity and spatiality of the expansion or intensification of unsanctioned neighborhoods, their stigma and misrepresentation and coercive governance and consolidation over time. And those were concepts that I talked about in the first seminar 3 weeks ago where I used this concept of favelization. So these are all dynamics that would be contributing to this unevenness of social reproduction. So an extensive scholarship building on the seminal work of Tronto, among others, and largely set in the global north, has studied care as a concrete practice and an ethic, and those two being interrelated. Recent papers have sought to apply care to as a practice and an ethic to urban settings, and that's relevant for what we're doing here. These papers express optimism that a caring orientation or ethics informing the practices of care may alter social relations towards lenses and towards less individualized ways of living in which others matter. So in that attentiveness and recognizing the needs of others and responsibility and responsiveness are all important. Wiesel et al. Note that challenging contexts that cities they note the challenging context that cities present for an ethics of care in which responsibilities are shared, and the challenges of that they talk about relate to neoliberalism and individualism, highly expressed in the global north, and with that marketized and individualized approaches to care under neoliberalism. And with that also social distancing and the othering of people. Within densely inhabited informal settlements in the global south, in which the uneven informal economy, in which even the informal economy is constrained by limited circulation of capital, one may expect the opposite of individualization, namely communalism, mutual dependence, solidarity, and collective caring. And these are all represented as ideals in feminist ethics of care. However, they should not be romanticized, particularly where coercive governance prevails, and this is a link back to that first seminar. I'll explore how emotions or effect towards place determine practices of care in Accra, Ghana. So there are some studies that have done this in the global south, and they identify incremental building or improvements of dwellings as practices of care, very relevant to Stjwetla. The incremental intensification and expansion complicates the narrative of care. So the fact that this practice of care of incrementally building also intensifies and makes things more difficult once again, complicates the narrative. Right. So turning then, sorry, wrong way. Turning to the limits of care in the context of need. So in the global north, the primary focus is on caregiving rather than on care receiving in the literature on practices of care. But in informal settlements, we're aware of an acute absence of provisioning and an inability to afford individualized, marketized care. And the context being structural deprivation and precarity that produce this need. And they bring the context and expression of need more directly into the study of care. So that's what I'm saying. This is my reading of the literature of the global south. And dynamics such as shared histories of dispossession and migration, kinship, and aspirations underpinning the relational ethics of care of the elderly, for instance, is the theme of a study by Ngobese et al. On an informal settlement in Zimbabwe, where they find that dynamics such as shared histories, shared histories of dispossession and migration and kinship aspirations are particularly prevalent in the ethics of care of the elderly, for the elderly, and what they also find is that duty and the duty to care and this dependency on reciprocity and agreements of change were part of that to determine the care. And with that, real limits to providing care and an anxiety for those that weren't able to reciprocate and provide care, and the anxiety of being a burden on others in this more collectivized form of care. Ansari, who was an intern in Cubes, documents fragile relational care for people with profound intellectual disabilities in the impoverished context of Slovo Park, an informal settlement in southern Johannesburg. And the importance, and she and Ngobese point to the importance of the lens of care for planners, but also point to the practices, to also point to the limits of those practices in the context of informal settlements. Yes, so moving then to our attempt, and perhaps I should speak for myself as using this lens more deeply, but I think it is a collective attempt at a careful approach to studying practices of care. The study draws on ongoing engaged fieldwork located within the larger area of the Frankenwald, Kelvin-Alexandra-Frankenwald City Studio that Paul already introduced, and grounded work and pedagogic work that Paulo already mentioned, along with an advocacy angle. My own research in the City Studio is under the broad framing of spatial justice and transformation, and my ongoing collective engagements, transit walks and interviews in Stjwetla are on this theme, and it's wonderful to have some of the people in the room that I've been speaking to, and that we've also been talking about this research already, as in the findings. Yes, so social reproduction and practices of care are helping me make sense of the findings. In Stjwetla, the City Studio collaborates, as Paul already mentioned, closely with both the Stjwetla Leadership Committee, and we've got Mike in the room. He's one of the committee leaders assigned to us by the committee as our collaborator, and the Stjwetla patrollers, and there are also some of them in the room. They are a community-based safety initiative whose members have often accompanied students on field trips, transit walks, and other field work. And so this initial insight, so Paulo mentioned that we, through a participatory suggestion board, in fact, at our official launch of the City Studio at Marlborough Station, in May last year, the patrollers noted down their need for uniforms and patrolling equipment. And this first insight into their precarity sparked an effort to understand the patrollers' circumstances and their patrolling initiative. So I try to make sense of community leaders' involvement in guiding. So on the one hand, it's the patrollers, but also community leaders' involvement in guiding the bottom-up or social production of dwellings, the dwelling environment, and the Stjwetla patrollers' commitment to their high-risk nighttime rounds, a constrained practice of care responding to the need for safety. In the interest of time, I'll only focus here on the patrollers, but it is relevant that all patrollers are interviewed, and the community leader, Mike, who has allowed me to use his name, have lost their contracted employment. In the first half of 2024, Mike worked as a security guard for a company that had a contract with Bombela, the Gauteng concessionaire, a position that he had held since the opening of the train line in 2010. However, in the course of 2024, Mike was laid off, and as an employer's contract with the Gautrain was not renewed and the company, so it claimed, was not successful in securing other contracts with which to employ him. I return just now to the patrollers' trajectories. But precarity resulting from the exploitative, brokered, and contracted suburban labor market, an expression of neoliberalism, is a widespread feature among the inhabitants I've spoken to in Stjwetla. This is corroborated by Hannah Dawson, who's in our room, her work, her extensive ethnographic research with youth in Zandspruit, an impoverished and partly unsanctioned neighborhood amidst the expanding, wealthy northwestern suburbs of Johannesburg. So, turning to the practices of care among Stjwetla patrollers. The paid Stjwetla patrollers as an organization consisted in 2024 of a team of 10 men and 8 women. By 2025, they were actually the women outnumbered. I conducted in-depth conversational interviews with 5 of the women last year. Their practice of care for safety in the community was closely tied to their relational circumstances and involved navigating considerable adversity. All 5 had worked for different cleaning companies and had lost their jobs in a similar way to mine. They were attracted to patrolling either because they had been directly affected by violent crime or knew others who were. The patrolling group, which had started in 2023, had initially come about through a call on a community WhatsApp group. Some were recruited later through neighborhood networks. In the women patrollers' views, since the patrolling, and this is a quote, since the patrolling started, people are sleeping better. There is less crime. A lady came yesterday to say she sleeps like a baby now. Some used to push their fridge in front of their door at night to be safe. When I asked about their particular approaches as women, their response was, when we patrol, we are men. We are just like the men. On transit walks, it was evident that they were well known and respected. However, their request to us through a participatory suggestion board, which I already mentioned at the launch, for assistance with uniform and equipment, was to ensure better visibility and respect while on duty. My research does not establish whether there is overreach, for instance, in extra legal punishment. Literature on patrolling in Cape Town suggests that such practices exist among community policing structures in low-income communities. In this respect, there is not only a limit to care, but also a fine line between the celebration of practices of care and condoning the neoliberal responsibilization, a term Superlo uses, to depict the state's expectation that communities take care of their own safety. I was more interested in the patrollers' insights into changes occurring in Stjwetla than in the patrolling practices as such. This revealed the roles of care the patrollers had taken in relation to neighborly disputes, as well as in rental referrals. On the former, and this is a quote, no one is controlling this place. If you have money, you build up. If your neighbor complains because you jumped the space, we will call that person. The neighbor comes here to complain. We go there with the owner and bring them to the office to discuss. We tell them to keep the space open. The guard hut at the entrance to the temporary relocation area, the greenhouse TRA in Stjwetla, serves as a drop-in center. On several occasions, while I was in the hut speaking to the patrollers, members of the public would drop in. Once a relative gave an update on a missing child, whereas vacant rooms or dwellings for rent were generally advertised on the community WhatsApp group. The patrollers explained that the prospective tenants also dropped in, particularly those in urgent need. The patrollers would also notice them while patrolling or in the daytime as they would carry their belongings after having been evicted. Operation Dudula, and we know here, but I'll mention in case there's anyone outside of South Africa attending, it's a xenophobic vigilante organization that seeks to expel foreigners from South Africa So Operation Lula at times would illegally evict inhabitants from houses on the Far East Bank. And one of the controllers had been a victim of this and found her way to Stjwetla, where the EFF had helped her build a room. She admitted having sunken into depression after losing her house and consequently losing her job due to absenteeism. There is evident solidarity among women controllers, and some directly expressed they were happy living in Stjwetla because they have rates here. So particular practices of care on the part of the community and leadership in relation to the settlement expansion and consolidation, as well as to safety patrolling by women as practices of care. That's really what this is all about. Both these are entangled, but also constrained with intensification of the settlement through continuous consolidation, or put differently, the ongoing social production of the habitat. At the same time, these entities, which are the controllers and the leadership, appear to stem or prevent the infiltration of coercive and extractive governance. And in the actual paper that I'm drawing on here, a lot of that is expanded on. These are important humanizing aspects that can counter stigma and misrepresentation of such neighborhoods, while drawing informed attention to an intensifying condition that requires solutions developed from below, and where the knowledge, which is where the knowledge, expertise, and care is located. The findings project increasingly complex future for careful actors to anticipate and consider. So I say this with a lot of dignity to the people in the room, particularly who are people that experience this and with this care and who we're learning from here. Thank you. So that is what I do. Chair, and I'm handing over to Christina.
Thank you very much. This is fantastic. I'm shifting focus slightly here. Thank you so much for including me in the session. I'm presenting some of our very, very early findings from a project that I've been working on over the last little while that focuses on governing a just urban transition. Before I jump in, let me give you a little bit of a background to what our focus is when we talk about governing a just urban transition. Now, our project stems from global crises of like environmental sustainability, climate change related crises that we urgently need to respond to, but at the same time, we have deep social crises of deep poverty, deep inequality, and the focus on a just transition is making sure that our response to environmental crises cannot exacerbate inequality, cannot exacerbate the social crises that we are facing, and rather we need to move into a direction where we are looking at socially just ways of becoming more environmentally sustainable. But critical for this is a focus on cities, and there's quite widespread agreement that if cities don't produce a just transition, we're not going to be able to do that globally. And this is certainly something that's being mentioned at the South African scale as well. And so another key thing of this particular project is the governing side of things. The challenge of bringing social justice and environmental sustainability together is not a technical, well, not primarily a technical thing, but it's deeply political, deeply social, and it requires a multiplicity of actors, both state and non-state actors. And really what our project aims to try and understand is what are some of the everyday practices, what are the everyday strategies of accessing water and energy that can contribute to a deeper understanding of what it takes to govern the just urban transition. Now, our particular focus of this project is on looking at small businesses in low-income areas. This gives much more information than I'm going to go into too much detail this particular slide. But we as a team are focusing both in areas in Johannesburg and Cape Town, and specifically in Johannesburg, we're looking at Stjwetla, and in Cape Town, we're looking at Khayelitsha. We've taken quite a few different types of methods into account, and particularly today, I'm going to be drawing on one of our qualitative methods, talking about called photo voice, where we've provided a number of participants who are business owners in Stjwetla with cameras to take photographs of things that are really important for their business in accessing water and energy. And then after they've taken those photographs, they've told us stories about what's really, really important for them and their business. And the idea is to, from these, build up a grounded understanding of the everyday realities of businesses in low-income areas that really have the potential of being left behind in broader city and national scale attempts to shift towards a just urban transition, or I suppose a sustainability transition. We've specifically focused on 5 different types of businesses. I'm not going to present on every single one of these here today, but we've looked at creches or early childhood development centres, informal eateries, borschies and yamas, taverns, shpins, car washes and hair salons. And each of these different types of enterprises use energy and water in very different ways. And each of these have developed different strategies. So these are some of the stories that we've started building. So let me quote. So this is a photograph taken by one of our participants who runs a car wash. And he says, this photograph describes how he fetches water. But if you look in the back, this fence is connected to electricity and it can shock you. So this is a daily practice of his collecting water. And you can see here, this is a municipal tap that he's filling 2 buckets of water then he uses through the day. So even if the tap runs out of water, which it does on a very regular basis, if not on a daily basis throughout the course of the day, he's still able to run his business because he has the water that he needs. He'll often have to wake up very early in the morning when there's water in the taps before they've run out over the course of the day, as the demand on the infrastructure is much higher than the infrastructure can really cope with. You've also spoken about different types of approaches. I don't know if you can see it here, but there's a second tap just behind this tap that's filling up the front bucket. Now that second tap is not a municipal tap. It's a tap that a number of the people living and involved in that particular area have gone together to and have arranged to be piped through from a slightly more secure source, that even if the municipal supply fails, that tap sometimes still provides water. So and the skills required to put that tap in was someone from the local community who has those skills and has contributed that to a collective solution to improving water access. This is a photograph taken by someone running a hair salon, and this her description is this one costed me a lot. When they come, they just want their hair to be done. I had no choice but to run to my friend and borrow this generator, but it was very far from where I was working. And her further description of this, she said, should be in the middle of doing someone's hair, and then we'd need to straighten it, or we'd need to blow dry it. So they both pick up, go across the road, come down this alley to where she could plug in her devices and do whatever that process that she needs to do at that point then return to her shop, do that, and then often would have to come back. And of course, like as a customer, that puts a lot of burden on customer satisfaction for this lady running this business. And although she was able to make a plan around accessing electricity as she needed it, it comes with additional burden. I might have to shift quickly along for some of these. I'm not going to give all the additional stories behind them. This photograph was described as this is a place of business and it is key. But we use charcoal because there is a problem with electricity. And the buckets, which you can see at the back, that white bucket in the back, also shows how we have to collect water. So this photograph, just very briefly, was a photograph that he found. He wanted to present. He was proud of the business that he was able to put together, how he kept his business keen despite the difficulties in running a business of this type in his circumstances. And then this final photograph that I'm going to present here is from someone who runs a shipping. Said, there is a tank that is outside, but I can't drink the water. This is a municipal tank that is filled up every couple of days by the municipality, but there is quite widespread understanding or widespread feeling among people in the community that they can't trust the quality of the water, despite probably the assumptions that the city that this is sufficient quality for people to use as a real backup when the municipality municipal water fails or is insufficient. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these insights, but some of the emerging strategies, like businesses rely on multiple sources of water and energy, building in flexibility to cope with intermittent and unreliable supply. From a water perspective, they anticipate daily cycles of water supply. They use a combination of communal taps, private household taps, and improvised piping solutions, as well as various other strategies of filling up. But as I mentioned, the municipal supply is sometimes not as reliable or as acceptable as would be ideal. From an energy perspective, again, there is a wide mix of sources. Many of these strategies are quite business specific. So, for example, eateries sometimes rely on wood. The hairdresser sometimes uses a paraffin stove or a generator, and sometimes a battery-powered light to be able to work into the evenings after everyone who's come back from work wants their hair done. Shebeens relying on bought ice when there are electricity outages. Other types of strategies include making sure that they have multiple payment devices so that if there's a long-standing outage, they can have the batteries of one device might outlast other devices. So those are like the devices that you can tap or pay using your phone. Those type of strategies are really quite important, but do require electricity. And now I've run out of time, so I'm going to just quickly wrap up. I think some of the key things, that have come through is that service or access to services really comes through from a mix of municipal supply, private actors, community-led initiatives, and this has a fundamental impact on not only what practical, technical solutions people have to make sure that they have the energy and the water they need, but it gives an indication of the governance networks and the range of people and organizations that are required to ensure the access to the services that they fundamentally need to be able to run their businesses. As Marie and others have mentioned, the board committee and the patrollers play a fundamental role as key brokers between the community and the municipality, especially when there are water and electricity issues through the municipal supplies. There are collective investments, as I mentioned, with new taps, and as well as a sharing of skills that on one hand show quite innovative, ingenuitive, like problem solving, as well as a sense of the reciprocity. And I suppose that speaks a little bit to some of what Marie was talking about, the ethics of care within the community. But again, I don't want to necessarily over-exalt how adaptable and ingenious some of these strategies are, because although they are deeply financially burdensome as well as labor intensive, and those things detract from the viability of the businesses that people are really trying to keep sustainable. And if we're thinking about like sustainability transitions, many of these additional strategies don't really align with some of the more sustainable, traditionally sustainable energy solutions, but there are aspirations. But a key issue around affordability of things like solar panels remains a fundamental barrier to these. So just to conclude, as I mentioned, while some of these strategies highlight remarkable adaptability and resilience, they also expose businesses to to significant risks, sometimes health hazards, financial burdens, and consistent unstable supply, despite this deep set of strategies. There really are a set of hybrid governance that really emerges. And these are really fundamental for businesses to ensure access to water and energy. And I suppose bringing us back to what this means for a just urban transition is that without recognizing the daily coping mechanisms that people and businesses are adopting in the areas that are most likely to be marginalized and not taken into account in broader national level transition debates. It's really important to take into account that without looking at these, sustainability is not possible without engaging the informal systems that sustain livelihoods within precarious urban contexts. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to all of our speakers, very enriching discourse and discussion. I think you've given us a lot to think about in terms of what people face in terms of precarities, vulnerabilities, threats, and at the same time how people operate and see a way through. I think there's many questions here in terms of to what extent these practices represent an alternative future. I'm going to hand it, I think, first to our online discussant. Dr. Mercy Brown-Luthango, are you online?
Yes, I am.
I'm going to hand over to you first to offer a few thoughts and reflections and possibly some questions or comments on the presentations you heard. You have about 7 minutes, and then we'll go to the room.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to use up too much time. I'm sure people in the room also have lots of questions. But just to say thank you so much to all the presenters for this very, very interesting and relevant reflections on the work, the research and teaching work that you've been doing. It sounds really amazing. And yeah, I'm just gonna reflect. I resonate a lot of what's been shared today resonates with my own work. And yeah, firstly, I just want to congratulate you on the establishment of this studio. I think it must be hugely rewarding to ground your research and your teaching work in a geographical space of this nature. But I'm sure it also comes with its challenges, and yeah, it would be wonderful at some point to just share some of the lessons of how you've gone about establishing this, and yeah, just what others can learn from your experience in establishing this studio. On one of my kind of first reflections is in terms of the first presentation, I think the interventions that you've mentioned in terms of the students' participation and contribution in Stjwetla, I think it's amazing that you're able to combine this real practical solutions with kind of the teaching, and I think that is so important in this kind of work. I have a question, which is a discomfort that I have with my own kind of research, where I've also looked at the impact of upgrading and small interventions in terms of violence prevention and from improving safety, is kind of, whereas small kind of interventions like providing the raincoats or even lighting, like solar lighting in informal settlements, do have an impact in terms of safety, everyday safety. We all know, as you also rightly point out, that violence and crime, it's multidimensional, and the structural kind of factors that underpin and sustain violence and unsafety. How do we kind of move from very small scale interventions to addressing the overarching structural elements and factors that sustain violence and crime? And so yeah, that's kind of my first reflection. On the second presentation, thank you so much, Marie, for that, for the wonderful kind of overview of the literature on infrastructures of care and social reproduction. And I really resonate with that, and your caution about being overly romantic about this infrastructures of care. And as you rightly point out, in an informal environment, it's really about care giving rather than care receiving, and that's a huge problem. And I think for myself, in grappling with some of my own work on the relationship between violence and upgrading of informal settlements, or looking at the impact of access to infrastructure on food security and nutrition security, I found that, as Christina's work so wonderfully illustrate the labor involved in everyday access to infrastructure, and concepts like infrastructures of care often overlook the stress and the strain and the labor involved in ensuring that people have access to infrastructure, this hybrid kinds of infrastructure. And I've found concepts, I've kind of revisited Abdul-Malik-Simone's concept of people as infrastructure, which I find for me not only kind of shines a light on the labor, the infrastructural labor involved in infrastructure access in this informal environment, but also points to the tenuous nature of the social relationships that make this infrastructure access possible, like the physical infrastructure. They're also tenuous, they're also sometimes it's not always collaborative. Sometimes there are tensions in informal settlements, which are often overlooked in the literature. And so for me, people as infrastructure also shines a light on how this is tenuous and also in need of constant care, in need of constant maintenance, like physical infrastructure. I find also the concept of infrastructural violence quite useful in my own work, because again, it shines a light on the real impact. Like Christina also points out, a lack of infrastructure can have real violent impacts for people in terms of people getting shot, children being electrocuted from the wires lying on the floor, on the ground. So for me, it also points to this infrastructure violence, which sometimes is not just social, but can also result in real physical harmful impacts for people. And so, yeah, I just thought I would point to those reflections, but thank you again so much for this very rich and interesting work, and yeah, all the best with everything going forward. And yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this seminar today.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for those comments. Shall we go to Hannah first, and then you can move on to go?
Great. Nice to meet this all. Okay. Yeah, so I also just start by saying, thank you for the invitation to listen and offer some comments, and yeah, also just well done to all of you engaged in these variety of important research, but also action-oriented projects. Clearly involve more people than those presenting. And in a way, Mercy's made my job quite easy, because she's raised a number of the broader points I wanted to. She's touched on a number of the things that also struck me. So I'll just make 3 remarks that, for me, things that maybe connected the papers together, and then I'll stick to some questions for the speakers, I think, rather than more kind of comments. So the first is, I don't know if you knew that CARE was going to stitch your papers together, so. But I was expecting it primarily in newspaper from the titles, but really it was clearly apparent in all of your papers. And I think, Marie, the way you set out a kind of framework for thinking about care as a shared ethic, a concrete practice, a form of collectivization, and yet I really appreciated, as Mercy was saying, the way in which you framed it by, thinking about the global South context, by framing it as thinking about its limits, the way in which it's burdensome, as Christina was referring to. And then the second thing that struck me about all of your papers is that I think you could have a longer conversation by putting them into conversation around what you learn methodologically and pedagogically by, and maybe because you all know each other's work better than I do, maybe these are obvious linkages, but I think I was intrigued if you were to draw out that thread. The first, community-led scaling, your emphasis on care and collaboration. Marie, your concept of care, a careful approach, which I really liked. And then, Christina and the pug, photo voice was the one example, but all of you engaged in kind of participatory, collaborative kind of methods. And so I think there's something there that you might want to pursue further. And then the third one is rather, but I think Mercy's touched on this already, but more a kind of, and I'm guilty of this in my own work too, what gets lost with the focus on the everyday, on improvisation, on adaptability, even on informality and the ways in which, we're trying to make visible what is often invisible. And what gets lost is the structures of violence, as Mercy was describing them as. But for me, what also often gets left out is the role of the state and the duty of care. If we want to talk about care, the duty of care that the state has on every issue that's been discussed here today. So when it comes to safety, no one really spoke about the police, even in all their limits, right? So the place of the state in policing and safety, the role of the state in, Christina mentioned ECDs, but the place of ECDs also as places of safekeeping or as shelter. And although I did think that Marie in particular highlighted the structural dimensions with, talking about the wider labor market and the kind of precarity of the everyday that was framed more like that. And then just quickly to the particular papers. On the first one, which I found so interesting, and some of my questions, I think, given we have, I think maybe some members of these community patrollers with us, even so, a lot of my questions were quite specific around these community patrollers in relation to the history of the settlement. What is their relation, if anything, to the thing structured like the community policing forum, their relationship to street committees, to also forms of mob justice, for other forms of, are they organized by subsections? How have they acquired legitimacy over time? So Marie helped unpick some of the details I wanted. And then I was, my second question related also quite specifically to these safety shelters. And if you could say a little bit more about why you chose the locations where you did. And it seemed from the image that they seemed to be used by women and by traders or those engaged in informal trade. And is that a specific need? Was their location tied to a particular need? And I was wondering if you could speak to the location of them, but also how access is controlled. Who gets to occupy a safety shelter? Marie, basically, I just wanted to say that I really valued your work on your emphasis on how, poor context, few resources don't necessarily lead to communing and mutual dependence. And I found the work of Eric Abare on reluctant solidarity very useful. And just wanted to kind of mention his work. So how do we think, not as binaries, but think of care as, I think you used the word fragile, but I think his framing of reluctant or even resentful solidarity actually captures something of the reality of what shared life looks like in many of the places that you write about and the one presented here. And then the second is, I was intrigued if you could say something about, I thought it's striking that there are as many women as men patrollers, or at least a very significant number, and how much that matters. The fact that it's not just men patrolling the street, but women, and the gender, how this also compares to other places where there are community patrollers. And then Tina, I wanted to just ask you if you could zoom in a little bit more to, you set up your paper as, we need to understand more about these everyday practices, these forms of adaptability, so we can govern the just transition better. And you ended with this idea of kind of hybrid governance, but I was wondering how you think, if we bring the state back in its absence or its unevenness or its partial, because the state in many ways celebrates informal entrepreneurialism in one breath and then polices it in another. So what does this really mean for governance when we're talking not just about informal governance, but we're the Jojo tank is there, the municipality is present in some form. But thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for those comments. Who would like to go first?
So thank you for those, very thought-provoking. Hello, Mercy. So lovely to see you again. That's very thought-provoking. Inputs from our respondents today. So I'll start with yours, Mercy, around violence is structurally driven. So what is the utility and relevance of small interventions? So I think it's quite important to, of course, acknowledge the structural nature of how violence is created and reproduced, and to say that perhaps if you engage with the structural from the level of the state, in this case, the local state, there's a need to kind of begin shifting how the state itself is structured, because it sits on a structure of violence, and so it inevitably introduces that in how it plans, and how it budgets, and how it designs programs. And so we think that once you introduce this idea of a participatory and all of society kind of approach to governance, to say that the state can play the role of a holding space for critical relationships that also enable, community agency. And so that is where the role of small but impactful interventions comes in, where you begin to test the things that work. You would still need to have those smaller interventions because you recognize also that all communities are different, although they may, the same types of violence may manifest in them, the drivers are completely different. And so there is that requirement at some level for your interventions to be small and then to scale. And then to also enable in smaller ways while you engage with the state as this big monolith at which you need to intervene in terms of beginning to knock down and address all the structural manifestations of crime and violence. And I'll link that, and it links quite nicely to what Hannah has said as well in her question about we're not seeing the state present in how you're framing this. Where is, the duty of care, for example, of the police? And to say that we as SACN, also collaborating with the studio and the school, we advance this idea that, safety is the business of everyone. And so, of course, you have the input that is very critical from a law enforcement and policing perspective. But in terms of making a city safer, it's not just the things that can be engaged with from a policing perspective that come to bear on whether or not we feel safe in a city. It's also about infrastructure. It's also about social and cultural attitudes. And so you need to intervene at all these levels. And where you want to stimulate or inspire or compel around the state's duty to care, it's important to think about what are the levels of intervention of various facets of the state, be it the national state or the local state. So, for example, in making public space safer for women, you need some input from a unit that is responsible for refuse collection. Similarly, a unit that is responsible for electrification. And so there, that demonstrates to us that in as much as it's about policing and law enforcement, violence and crime prevention, a different had an impact can be made by a planning unit in terms of how plans around infrastructure, in terms of how a refuse collection unit does its job. So it's the job of every unit in the city to recognize that in what it does, it's a contribution to safety or unsafety. And then so I think it also links to this idea that Prof. Marie shared around careful, approaches and techniques in terms of shifting from, responding to the everyday in terms of policing things as and when they happen, to say that you need longer term interventions that address the social, economic, and spatial drivers of crime and violence. I'll hand over to Paulo to also take a stab at these and around why we chose the locations we did, and to say that that was informed by the spatial inquiry that was conducted by students in collaboration with our community stakeholders to really identify the need. And I think I'll hand over to Paulo to really zero in on that. Thank you.
Great, I can address that one, yes. We ahead of the after the launch of the City Studio, when we heard those needs from the patrollers, we organized what we call a collective mapping workshop, where a series of a map and a series of icons were used as triggers to discuss the issues that are important or relevant in and around Stjwetla. And one of those icons was referring to the crime hotspots. And so we were interested to learn about where crime is perceived as, something more present. And from there, we we discussed, and then through the application to this program that the SACN was launching, we were able to select 2 places. We asked the patrollers which places they would say that could be priorities, and they chose those 2 gateways, the south and the north of Stjwetla. One, I think it also has a symbolic aspect, because the controllers then told me that used to be the meeting point, you know, when they started to the south next to the Basco Bridge. Woman is confirming this, right? And to the north, it's an area where the neighborhood kind of dedensifies and turns into a vacant site, and then especially in the evenings and at night, becomes a place where there's crimes are more likely to happen there. So I guess the third shelter that we are also working on, it's again a gateway. It's kind of in the boundary between, you know, there across Siphelele and Marble Gardens, and so the 3 sites are actually areas where the boundary of the neighborhood kind of defines its borders, and I think that's quite interesting to think about, because if we ask maybe some other someone who doesn't know Stjwetla would say that the inner side is where the crimes happen. Right? The perception from the community is that the crimes happen around it, not necessarily inside. Yes.
Anyone else on the last comment?
Thank both Mercy and for reflecting back and enriching that, and I took lots of notes, and I got to carry on reading and deeply good. Thank you for those pointers, but I think it's also a nice chance to bring people that are in the room into that conversation, especially around the questions about why there are so many women among patrollers and what that means. And I've only been engaging the women patrollers, but it would be interesting to hear how those, for instance, Ruben, one of the patrollers, what a difference it makes to be patrolling with women. But perhaps we'll quickly have come to you. You also felt your comments or was there anything to answer?
Hannah did ask a question about the importance of the state being brought back in, and I do think that is critical.
Because
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely, and I think from our framing of how do we govern a just transition, like the state is fundamental to that, especially because the state's fundamental role is ensuring that whatever happens, that there is social justice, and that's the fundamental basis that South Africa's constitution is based upon. So the state is central to that, but I think in much of the current debates, they are too central, and I think that's so I think hopefully. But I do think that the relationship between businesses in informal segment areas that maybe are characterized as informal, whatever definition you'd like to use for that, it is a very complex interaction with the state, and certainly in relation to access to water and energy.
Okay. I'd like to open it up to the floor then. Is there anyone who'd like to comment on the question or any of the questions? But I think specifically the one question on the role of women within the safety patroller group. It's there was a question around the impact of why, first of all, or how it came to be that there are so many women in the patroller group, but what that impact is on the group, on the dynamic of the group.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ruben. I'm the Chief of patrollers. Yes, we patrol with the women, there are many, but just because the patroller is a volunteer. Many people who was 42 on our patrol. But because some of them they get shot, some of them they kill. So it's whereby you see now we are 17. That's why some of the men they did run away from the patrollers. So that's why you see we left them by more women. Yeah, because when we started patroller first time, was the men, there was the men only. So what we have realized, some of the Tutsis, they go with their wives. So when they see the patrollers, they come in, sometimes they take whatever he got, they give the wife, and ourselves, we can't search the wife. So that's why we did make some meeting and recruit some women to come and join us. We said they can assist to search the women. It's what did that. Thank you.
Okay. Is there anyone online who has any questions or comments? I'd like to read, there are two comments in the chat that I'll quickly read. The first is from Timber Mohammed. That's from Marie's talk. I think this kind of trip towards shared responsibility and ethics of mutual care is key to so many core challenges. I've got a paper coming out in the coming days where I try to think through a bit of what internal shifts are involved in moving away from individualism towards collective solidarity from the perspective of an artist or researcher. I would love to hear anyone from the team reflecting on the potential, success, and limitations of inculcating this ethics of care in your studio, especially given some of the divisions and violence, e.g. as Siphelele discussed about the inclusion of women in public space. And a second comment from Lenny. I'm curious about how some of these findings and insights is shifting the main theoretical components that have directed our scholarly discussion around informality and informal settlement upgrading over the past 45 years, especially from scholars like Prof. Huchzermeyer, who has been in the space for so long. And then a last comment online from Kakhwa Saddam. In terms of governance and management, how do we bring in other sectors such as transport and mobility to enhance issues of safety, which affect last mile mobility? So, are there any questions or comments from anyone else in the audience?
So it's true that there's more women training.
Yeah, because 8 guys, 9 women.
So I want to understand the perception that they understand. Is that women are more vulnerable, right? Because most the violence in our society mostly happens to how I'm trying to understand how what is it that makes them what makes them these women who often they're victims of violence, but you never need to be one.
The crime was very high on that moment. As I said, sometimes you find the guy, if you're working with a woman, maybe he got some gun or whatever, something. You see, the patroller who's coming now, they know we're going to search him. So while they're working with a woman, as we was a man, we can't search a woman. We just take something and ask the woman. It's where we started to recruit the woman to join us.
So that was easy. Yes. It wasn't easy to get the women to come in.
We just call them by meeting, and tell them which challenge we face in the patrol.
We took 1 minute of the session. I think we can take one more comment. So the education of Timber and.
So I don't know if you could please just reiterate Tim's question. I do know that you did touch on women in public space as an example, and a retreat of women from public space as an example, but there were other high-level thoughts that, yeah, so.
I think the main questions I'd love to hear, from team reflecting on potential successes or limitations.
Oh. Maybe I'd like to take a stab. So. So the limits, of including so I think it's been a central challenge, and I remember in this very room, we had a discussion in 2023 when we were talking about preparing, should we do the city studio or not? And from the beginning, there was, and I think we'd already done just one sort of staff field visit to Stjwetla, probably back by, and the controllers took us around. And I think there was from the start sort of staff were very concerned about our burden on this community. When we return, I think it's the seminar that's on pedagogy, the second last one or the last one? The second last one. We'll also consider a little bit the limits of or what it means for a community to host this kind of effort. Which is something we were from the beginning. I think there was concern among staff and actually among some of the staff that didn't get involved in the city studio, and we need to go back and find out, is that the reason they didn't get involved, or was it just because they happened to not sort of find a place in it, whatever. But it was for that reason that I think our research fund was also willing to make funds available for the patrollers, and there was that concern that our work shouldn't be burdening, but that is just our concern. Beyond that, we want to actually be caring. We want to do more than just paying for what we kind of taking almost, and we would hope that. So it links a little bit with Lene's question about how does all of this at least make me rethink upgrading or think differently about upgrading. And I think there's a question that is about entry points into upgrading, and how can our presence in Stjwetla, our still very limited understanding of this very complex almost city with lots of vibrancy, so many different activities happening. How can our presence there be an entry point for scaling, basically, is the term. How does it interface with the UISP? Does it at all? Is there any way a connection can be made? What we were talking about last week was part the sort of mapping and drone and 3D imagery of this. How can that be used to value the settlement, to push back against the floodline that threatens to have it all demolished, or that kind of says some of this is worth something. It's people's lives. Can there be engineering solutions to this river? Does the river have to be the danger that it is? So I think those are really conversations that need to start coming out, and we hope everybody will join us at the City Forum. It's far for you to travel, Mercy, on the 28th. We've got this wonderful big hall that the architecture students are transforming into a big exhibition or forum space, and where these kind of conversations hopefully can get had with more stakeholders that have the agency to make a difference. We're very, very happy that CZ's been coming to the seminars. Thank you. That we know that you aren't the one official who's going to make it all happen, but at least you're here and you're listening and asking questions.
I'm going to try to take a stab at Timber's question, and I want to just zero in on that point around women in public space, and hopefully link it to something we didn't address that Hannah asked around, you know, how was the need identified in terms of the presence of women trader in that space. I think that's just something that happened organically, and it just happened to tie to what our intention was by creating those shelters. And our thinking and what drove us was that we wanted to create a space for collectivization in the community. We didn't predetermine the uses. They kind of just happened on their own, and that in and of itself kind of taught us something, and it began to hit at various things that we've been trying to target throughout our work as the SACN and also as this partnership. So no, there was no predetermination. However, to Timber's question about, you know, what I mentioned around crime and violence being something that drives the absence or the retreat of women from public space, and the limits of collectivization, or what do we call them? What did we say around you said something quite poignant that I want to come back to. So now I'm going back to my notes. Crack. Yes, okay. Yes, that's what I'm looking for. I think they kind of the need creates itself, right? And what we talk about community agency. It just so happens that, you know, communities are always rising to the occasion. A question came from the city of, so our understanding and what we know is that, you know, women are disproportionately affected by crime and violence, but how does it happen that, you know, the patrollers in this space just so happen to be majority women? I think it comes from a recognition and that manifestation of community agency and a recognition of a need as well. So I would say, in as much as, you know, there's the burden of care, how our communities are structured is that, you know, there's always that drive to kind of respond to a need as it's recognized. And then there was something around safety and last mile mobility, I think. Yeah. Okay, happy.
But I want to pick up on what you
Stop it
said,
there,
it's
yeah.
kind of question of what you said. I think it ties in very nicely to something you said earlier, which is creating a whole new space, and that is the state's role, that is the university's role, that is the shelter's role. That if we can create the space for social relations to find interaction, there's a very nice way that this kind of notion of care can really take.
Yeah.
That's very powerful.
I'll just very briefly, because I was research talking this last mile and the mobility. So that this extremely tight fabric, and you saw on the drone imagery how few wide roads there are in Stjwetla. So last mile mobility is pedestrian, and it's through very narrow alleyways. When we did our mapping a few weeks ago, something I at least observed is how people navigate these narrow spaces. They have to navigate, a lot of them, to get from their home to the street to where they might catch a taxi. And there was such a lot of polite, you know, you stand back, let the other person pass through first, because only one person can pass at a time, through these very narrow passages, as they call it. Yes, so I think there's something we don't understand yet, but we need to learn from, which is it's a way people navigate very politely the sort of the very constrained. It's a reality that I wouldn't think anyone would be capable of living in such a dense environment where some houses can't even open their door properly because the passageway isn't wide enough. And yet people live and people navigate and from some of, I mean, yeah, people prefer living there than next to the river, it's safer, it's, so there's, yes, I think there's a lot still that we have to try and understand.
Well, great. Thank you everyone online for joining us and everyone joining us in person. It was very rich discussion. And hopefully you'll all be able to join us for next week's discussion or presentation. I will be presenting alongside Christina on research we've been doing on the reproduction of the farm. So some of that was good to see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.